Hi everyone, this is video 2 of the introduction. In the previous video, I gave an in-depth look at the different strategies that you have to use for your lead-in, and I do mean have to use. These are universally employed strategies, so you've got to kind of know them. And we looked very briefly at the tag and the synopsis, and we didn't talk about the thesis yet, but we're going to talk about the thesis in the next video. So let's have a look at some models to see how you can put all these components together. This essay was written about 2 poems. It's called A View of Death, and as you can see, it's well integrated. The 4 components are very well integrated. The black synopsis stuff is a little bit longer than maybe it has to be, but when you're talking about poems that maybe nobody else has read, the class might not have read them, or the teacher might not have read them, you could be assigned to write on any poem that you want to write about, you might have to provide this stuff. So let's have a look. For obvious reasons, death is a topic very often viewed pessimistically. Stories and poems about death usually strike at least a solemn, if not mournful tone. Some literature, however, defies this convention. So do you recognize that? If you watched my last video, you might. That's the opposition, popular opinion, disagreeing, and missing perspective. What's the most obvious lazy understanding of poems about death? Everybody knows that they're going to be sad, that they're laments, they're elegies. Well, you're going to turn it around and say, hey, listen, guys, I know this is what you think of when you think of death poems, but I found something that's kind of cool and they're different. So let's have a look at this. So that piques the reader's interest and makes you look like you're going beyond what everybody else understands about poems about death. Some literature, however, defies this convention. The lyric poems Crossing the Bar by Alfred Lord Tennyson and Because I Could Not Stop for Death by Emily Dickinson both portray death in an optimistic light. Tennyson's poem is a lively metaphor of death as an adventure at sea, and Dickinson's contains a personified depiction of death as a graceful, dignified gentleman. Both these portrayals of death are revealed through the poem's tone and imagery. Tight, short. I'm a big fan of short introductions. This could maybe, again, if you're talking about a popular novel, you don't even have to do that. Keep it short, keep it tight. We've got the tag up here, not wasting time. Identify what kind of poem it is. You could, if it's a free verse poem, and that's important, you could say the free verse poems, whatever, the Renaissance poems, whatever. These are as much identification as you can get in there efficiently is useful. Okay, let's look at the next one. This next introduction is interesting. It's called Guilt in Macbeth, if you've done that play. It's different. It starts with the tag and the synopsis stuff. If you're in a pinch, if you're in class, you're doing an in-class essay, and you don't know how to start your introduction, and you hate introductions, you know you have a thesis, you know what you kind of want to say about the whatever, start with this. In William Shakespeare's The Tragedy of Macbeth, the main character murders the good King Duncan. Lady Macbeth, his wife, is accessory to the murder. Just start with, in the poem whatever, this happens. In the movie whatever, this happens. You can do that. It's a bit of a cheat, but as you'll see, it actually works quite well. It's a different technique than starting with this kind of lead-in. The reason why our triangle for the introduction is upside down is that we start with the general and we end up with the specific. So as you'll notice in this one, we do start general. Here we're talking about all poems, all death poems generally, Then we get into these particular poems that we're going to explore. Here we don't do that. We stay quite focused on the play itself, so you don't have to talk about all tragedies or all murders or all Shakespeare plays. We're staying focused on the Macbeth, so you can start with that. Okay, so in William Shakespeare's This Happens. Husband and wife are clearly the ones to blame for the crime and deserve punishment. But what about the manipulative witches? Are they therefore innocent? And what about Banquo, who suspected Macbeth's intentions? And what about Duncan himself, who was surely naive in trusting both Thanes of Cawdor? A close look at these 3 minor characters will reveal that they deserve at least some share in the blame for either causing or failing to prevent the murder. So you see what's happening here. It's actually, do you see what I mean about you can't avoid these techniques? They're all in here, all of them. It's just what we do. It's just how literature analysis works. I could be wrong about that. So put some of your ideas in the comments and prove me wrong, because I'd like to learn some new stuff. Anyway, so here it is. Everyone, what's the laziest interpretation of guilt in Macbeth? Well, of course, Lady Macbeth did it, or even just Macbeth, because he's the one who held the knife. But there's something missing here, obviously, okay? And that thing that's missing is a problem, like I talked about in the previous video. The problem is that everybody acted weird in this play. There's a lot of guilt to go around, and we didn't talk about it in class, or people tend not to talk about it, or it's too easy just to blame Macbeth or Lady Macbeth or both of those people. So you present the problem: popular opinion, disagree, missing perspective, problem, question, and solution. It's all in there. And what does your thesis do? It provides the solution. Yep, nobody's thought about this. This stuff is a problem, and my essay, read my essay, ladies and gentlemen, and you will have an answer to this problem. Classic. So you'll notice this one's a little bit different again. It's actually quite long. It looks a little bit ponderous and intimidating, but this essay, of course, would probably be a little bit longer than the previous ones. This one would be definitely at least 1,000 words or more. As you'll see, it's a good example of the type of topic that requires more extensive definition of terms and more extensive cultural background. We'll look at the title: alienation and the metamorphosis. A big word like alienation has to be unpacked early, because you might not know what it means, or the way you're going to talk about it in your essay there might be nuances to the word that have to be unpacked. You might be trying to approach it in this particular way, but a general understanding of it is this other particular way, so you have to explain it. So you'll see what I mean when we read through it. Let's just have a look at this before we read it. Really, really tight synopsis. We've got the title. It's Metamorphosis. This is the guy who wrote it, and it's a novella, so that's nicely packed in there. And all we need for it is this little bit of information about what the story is all about. There's a transformation of the protagonist into an insect. That's really all you need. So there's no one way to do this. When I tell you that you have to use these strategies, it might sound like I'm telling you that there's a formulaic, mechanistic way of writing. No. As you'll see, these three that we've looked at are actually quite different. In the first one, we had quite an extensive synopsis depiction of what the works were about. But here, it's just this little tiny thing, because because the requirements of this particular essay are that we unpack big words like this and not spend too much time on the synopsis. Okay, let's have a look. One of the most important themes in all of Western 20th century art and literature is existential alienation. Do you notice that we're starting wide? We're starting general. We're talking about all of Western culture, really, for the past 100 years, and then we're going to focus it down. Progressive developments such as the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution brought into question the traditional structures of society that once provided people with comfort, identity, and meaning. Church attendance plummeted, people abandoned local village life for impersonal cities and factory jobs, and the new freedoms of capitalism encouraged the pursuit of individual instant gratification at the expense of values such as duty to family and community. It is not surprising then, nice phrase, look at that, steal it, steal it, steal it. It is not surprising then that one of the masterpieces of 20th century fiction, the novella Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka, deals with the theme of alienation. Through the symbolic transformation of the protagonist into an insect, the author suggests that modern alienation results in the dehumanization of the self. There's my thesis. I'm going to look at the form and how the form explores the content. We're going to look at that in another video. Okay, so again, phrases like that, remember them. Remember the rhythm. Read these aloud, or listen to me reading them again. Read them aloud several times over, and the more you read these aloud, you'll burn the rhythm of the components, how the tag leads into the synopsis, how the synopsis leads into the lead-in, etc., etc. So get a sense of these. So this last model is another short and sweet introduction, and it follows the lead-in approach method. What lens will you use to understand the text? And you'll see what I mean when we read it. It's called Character in Crisis. In fiction, readers can learn much about a protagonist by witnessing how they react to a crisis. In fact, writers often seem to present such crises specifically to test the nature and quality of the protagonist's character. So you see, I'm starting general. I'm not talking about the short stories yet. You have no idea what I'm going to talk about. It's talking about fiction generally, and then I'm going to focus it down to my two stories, of course. But you see how it's a lens. I'm going to look at these two stories. I'm going to compare these two stories by thinking about them as thought experiments in the minds of the writers. And by doing that, by using that approach, I'm going to reveal something interesting about the texts. This seems to be the case In the short stories Hills Like White Elephants by Ernest Hemingway and One of These Days by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, each of the main protagonists in these stories is faced with a potentially life-changing decision, and despite their equally powerless status, Marquez's character demonstrates more independence and strength of character. So now we know we're going to do a comparison-contrast essay, a synthesis essay, looking at the two main characters. If you notice, the synopsis is almost not a synopsis. All it does is talk about a potentially life-changing decision, and I'm not talking about it as a war poem or a war story or whatever. It's actually quite general, so don't get too hung up on the synopsis. All right, so those are the 4 models, and I believe we've got all of the approaches in them. Like I said before, read them all back, get a sense of the rhythm, how to flow from one idea to the next, from one component to the next. The last component in the introduction, of course, is the thesis statement. It's the most important one. You probably have a vague idea of what a thesis statement is. It's what you want to say about the works, but generating your own thesis is not easy, if my memory serves correctly, from when I was a student. So what I've come up with is a method to help you generate ideas to come up with your own thesis statement. So come back to my next video. Thanks for watching.